Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into Debunking Marxism, a red-pilled reality by Conrad Riker.
Sounds intriguing.
It is. We figured this one might be right up your alley, especially if you're trying to, wrap your head around all this talk about covert contracts and relationships and how, society's kind of gone topsy-turvy over time.
Yeah, Raker really gets into how Marxist ideas, or at least what he sees as Marxist ideas, have seeped into the culture.
Right. Like it's not just some dusty old theory. Well, he argues it's affecting everything. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's start with the basics.
Sounds good to me.
So the book kicks off with, Karl Marx himself, right? Born into a Jewish family, but they later converted to Christianity.
Yeah, and Riker kind of makes you think about how that might have shaped his worldview. How much does your upbringing influence your whole outlook on life?
That's a good point. And then, of course, you've got all this stuff happening in Europe back then. It was like the 19th century Industrial Revolution, new ideas about individual rights. Everything's changing.
Totally. That's got to impact your thinking if you're a deep thinker like Marx was. Imagine the buzz, right? All this new tech, new ideas about freedom, huge shifts in society.
It's like today, in a way, with all the, internet stuff and everyone arguing about everything constantly.
Uh-huh. Yeah, maybe. Riker really emphasizes how the intellectual atmosphere shaped Marx. It's like you can't understand the guy without understanding the world he was living in.
Okay, that makes sense. And then there's this whole thing about some philosopher named Hegel.
Oh, yeah, Hegel. That's a bit of a brain twister.
Yeah.
Basically, he had this idea about dialectics, which, in super simple terms, means ideas clashing and then something new emerges. Think of it like two forces collide, boom, something new pops out.
Okay, I kind of get that. So Marx took that idea and...
And he applied it to history, basically. Came up with this whole historical materialism thing.
So, instead of great people or big events driving history, it's all about, who's got the money and the resources.
Bingo. Who controls the means of production, controls everything else, the laws, the culture, even, what we believe. Pretty radical, right?
It is. Makes you wonder, are we really in control of our own thoughts and actions, or are we just playing out some economic script?
Whoa, now that's a deep thought. And it kind of connects back to the whole covert contract thing, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's like maybe there are these unwritten rules, these power dynamics that we're all just kind of stuck in.
Totally. And that brings us to, one of Marx's core concepts, the labor theory of value.
Which is?
Well, it basically says that the value of something comes from the work put into making it. The person who actually builds the chair, they're the ones creating the value, not the guy who owns the factory.
So if I get this right, he's saying the worker should get all the profit, not the boss.
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's the general idea. He called the profit that goes to the owner surplus value and saw it as, straight up exploitation.
Wow. Okay. So Riker is basically saying we need to pay more attention to these economic forces, right? How they might be shaping our lives in ways we don't even realize.
Totally. And, maybe even affecting those covert contracts in our relationships,
Oh, I never thought of it like that. There's also this whole thing about alienation of labor, right?
Yeah, and this one might really hit home for some folks. Ever feel like you're just going through the motions at work, no real purpose or passion? That's alienation.
Oh, I've totally been there, feeling like a cog in a machine just churning away.
Exactly. Marx thought capitalism basically baked that feeling into the system. It separates you from what you produce so you don't feel connected to it anymore.
Man, that's heavy. So we've got, Marx's background, a few of his big ideas.
Right. We're just getting started.
But the book doesn't just explain this stuff. It also criticizes it, right?
Oh, yeah. Riker definitely has some bones to pick with Marx.
Like what?
Well, for one, he goes after the idea of abolishing private property. That was a central part of Marx's vision for communism, but Riker argues it's a recipe for disaster.
Economically.
Exactly. He says it kills innovation and motivation. Why bother creating or building anything new if you can't even own it?
I can see that. Who's going to take risks if there's no reward?
Right. And he uses some real-world examples to back it up, like what happened in Venezuela. It's a pretty sobering look at what can go wrong when you try to force these ideas onto a society.
So is Riker saying we should just toss out all of Marx's ideas?
Not necessarily. He acknowledges that Marx had some valid points about the problems of capitalism, especially when it comes to exploitation. But his solutions, not so much.
So, Critique the system, but be careful about the supposed fixes.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where the book's discussion of alternatives to Marxism comes in. It's not just about tearing things down, it's also about exploring other paths.
Okay, let's talk about those alternatives then.
Hmm.
The book mentions things like classical liberalism and objectivism. What are those all about?
Well, think of classical liberalism as like individual freedom, limited government, let the markets do their thing. Thinkers like John Locke, Adam Smith, that kind of vibe.
Okay, so kind of like the founding principles of the U.S.
Yeah, there are definitely some parallels there. And Riker seems to think those ideas might resonate with you, especially if you're all about self-reliance and, charting your own course.
Makes sense. And what about this objectivism? It sounds intense.
Oh, it is. That's the whole Ayn Rand philosophy, reason, individualism, and this idea that pursuing your own rational self-interest is the highest moral goal.
Whoa. That's a lot to unpack. So
Okay.
it's not about equality or the collective good.
Nope. It's about maximizing your own potential, living by your own code. It's definitely controversial, but it offers a totally different perspective compared to Marx.
So Riker's throwing out all these different ideas, making us think about different ways of looking at the world.
Yep. He's not saying one is right and the others are wrong. It's more about encouraging you to explore these different perspectives and see which ones resonate with you.
Okay, that's a lot to take in. But I'm definitely seeing how this book could help me understand, like, not just the big societal stuff, but also my own relationship with my wife.
That's awesome. You're starting to see how these big ideas can have really personal implications.
I am. And it's making me wonder about all these covert contracts in relationships. If the whole system is set up a certain way, maybe we need to be more aware of those unwritten rules and, like, renegotiate them.
That's a brilliant insight. You're really starting to connect the dots between your personal life and these bigger societal forces.
This is pretty heavy stuff, but it's also eye-opening. I feel like I'm starting to see the world in a whole new light.
That's the power of this kind of critical thinking. It can be uncomfortable, but it can also be really liberating.
So we've covered, like, Marx's background, a few of his key concepts, the critiques.
Right, and we've just scratched the surface.
Okay, what's next?
Well, things are about to get even more interesting as we delve into the social and cultural impact of Marxism, and that's where it becomes really relevant to your deep dive.
Oh, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Okay, so Riker argues that Marxist thought has influenced modern society in ways we might not even realize. We're talking education, media, even how we think about things like gender and race.
Wait, hold on a second.
Yeah.
Are you saying that everything I learned in school was Marxist propaganda?
Not everything, of course. But Riker does raise some important questions about how Marxist ideas may have snuck into institutions like education and the media. He's suggesting we need to be more critical, question the narratives we're being fed, even from seemingly authoritative sources.
That makes sense. I mean, I'm all for equality and fairness, but I don't want to be brainwashed either.
Exactly. And Riker is encouraging you to be aware of the subtle ways ideologies can shape our worldview, often without us even realizing it. It's about recognizing the potential influence of Marxist thought, even when it's not explicitly stated.
Wow, this is getting pretty deep. But I'm feeling more and more like this book is going to help me understand the bigger picture and connect the dots between my personal life and the larger forces at play in society.
That's precisely the goal of our deep dive. It's about understanding the connections and seeing how they shape our experiences.
So we've talked about education and media. What other areas does Riker explore?
Well, he gets into some pretty controversial territory, like the relationship between Marxism and feminism. It's a complex and often heated topic, but Riker's analysis offers some interesting insights.
Ooh, that's a hot topic. What's his take on it?
He's pretty critical of what he calls Marxist feminism. Riker argues that this particular brand of feminism often undermines the very freedoms it claims to champion.
That's interesting. I've definitely seen some of those debates play out online where some feminist arguments seem to contradict the idea of individual liberty.
Exactly. Riker wants you to think critically about those debates and consider whether some of the solutions proposed by Marxist feminists are truly addressing the root causes of inequality or potentially creating new problems.
So it's about questioning the narrative, even when it comes from a movement that claims to be fighting for equality.
Precisely. The book encourages you to think for yourself and not blindly accept any ideology, no matter how well-intentioned it might seem.
That's a powerful message. It's making me rethink a lot of my assumptions about feminism and its goals.
And that's just one example of how Riker challenges conventional wisdom. He also tackles critical theory, which he sees as a direct descendant of Marxist thought and its growing influence in academia and social justice circles.
Critical theory. That sounds familiar.
It's become pretty influential. Riker argues that while critical theory claims to expose power structures, it often ends up creating new forms of division and oppression.
Wow, that's a bold claim. What evidence does he present for that?
Well, he points to things like the rise of identity politics and the increasing focus on group differences rather than individual rights and shared humanity. He sees this as a dangerous trend that undermines social cohesion and individual freedom.
So instead of bringing people together, it's actually driving them apart.
That's Riker's argument. He's suggesting that critical theory, while claiming to promote equality, often ends up creating new forms of hierarchy and resentment.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. This book is all about challenging the narratives we're told and thinking critically about the ideas that shape our world.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that even well-intentioned ideologies can have unintended consequences. And it's about being aware of the potential pitfalls of Marxism, even when it's presented in a more palatable form, like critical theory or Marxist feminism.
This is some heavy stuff, but it's also incredibly empowering. I'm starting to feel like I have a new set of tools to understand the world around me.
That's the goal of this deep dive, right? To give you those tools and help you see the world with fresh eyes.
Okay, so we've talked about the social and cultural impact of Marxism. What else does the book cover?
Well, it delves into the internal contradictions and failures of Marxism in practice. It's not just about critiquing the theory, it's about examining how those ideas have played out in the real world.
I'm definitely curious to hear more about that. What are some of the examples the book uses?
Well, Riker talks about the collapse of the Soviet Union, the economic struggles in Venezuela, and the human rights abuses in countries like North Korea. It's not a pretty picture, and he uses these examples to highlight the dangers of utopian ideologies taken to their extremes.
That sounds pretty bleak. Is he saying that any attempt to create a more equal society is doomed to fail?
Not necessarily, but he is arguing that Marxist solutions have a track record of creating more problems than they solve. It's about recognizing the limitations of those solutions and being open to other approaches.
So it's about learning from the mistakes of the past and finding better ways to address inequality and injustice.
Precisely. The book isn't about despair. It's about hope. It's about finding a path forward that avoids the pitfalls of Marxism while still striving for a more just and equitable world.
That's a message I can get behind.
And the book goes on to explore some of those alternative paths. It talks about classical liberalism, libertarianism, and even conservatism.
Wait, conservatism, isn't that the opposite of Marxism?
In many ways, yes. But the book isn't about ideology for its own sake. It's about finding solutions that work. It's about being pragmatic and open to different perspectives.
So it's about looking beyond the labels and finding common ground.
Exactly. Riker encourages you to think for yourself and not be limited by preconceived notions about what's left or right.
That's a refreshing approach. I'm starting to see how this book can help me break out of the echo chambers and engage in more productive conversations.
That's a great insight, and the book is full of these kinds of insights.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about Marx's background, his key ideas, the book's critique of those ideas, and some alternatives to Marxism. We've also explored the social and cultural impact of Marxism, as well as its internal contradictions and failures.
And we've touched on the psychological manipulation often used by Marxist regimes to maintain power, which could be relevant to your exploration of power dynamics in relationships.
That's right. It's been a pretty intense deep dive so far, but it's also been incredibly eye-opening. I'm starting to see the world in a whole new way.
That's the power of this kind of critical thinking. It can be uncomfortable, but it's also incredibly liberating.
Okay, so where do we go from here?
Well, there's still much to unpack. The book goes on to explore the relationship between Marxism and religion, the environmental impact of Marxist policies, and the media's role in shaping our understanding of these ideas.
Wow, there's still so much to cover. I'm hooked.
I knew you would be. This book is a real page-turner, even if you're not usually into political theory. It raises questions that are relevant to all of us, regardless of our background or beliefs.
I'm ready for more. Let's keep going.
All right, let's dig into that relationship between Marxism and religion then. It's a tricky one, that's for sure. Full of, contradictions and historical clashes.
Yeah, in the book, it's framed as this, fundamental clash of ideologies. Religion is all about faith and spirituality.
Yeah, right.
Looking beyond the material world.
Right, and then you've got Marxism, which is hyper-focused on material conditions, economic systems, the stuff you can see and touch. Totally different starting points.
Makes sense. So where does Marx himself land on this?
Well, he famously called religion the opiate of the masses, which is a pretty loaded statement. Basically, he saw it as a way to, like, pacify people, keep them content with their lot in life, even if they're being exploited.
So religion was like a drug, dulling their senses to the real problems.
That was his view. And Riker explores how this clash has actually played out in history. Like, think about the Catholic Church resisting Marxist regimes in places like Poland.
Right, they were pretty strong opponents of communism.
Exactly. And then, on the flip side, you had religious groups being persecuted under communist rule in places like the Soviet Union or China.
It's wild how these belief systems, both religious and political, can have such a huge impact on societies, even individual behavior.
For sure. And Riker is pushing us to consider how these beliefs, these systems, shape everything. Our values, institutions, even like how we relate to each other in our personal lives.
It goes back to those covert contracts we were talking about, right?
Totally. It's all connected.
Okay, so religion and Marxism, they don't exactly see eye to eye. What about the environment? How do Marxist policies stack up when it comes to, like, taking care of the planet?
That's an interesting one, because you might think environmentalism goes hand in hand with left-wing ideologies, right?
Yeah, that's kind of the stereotype.
Well, Riker throws a bit of a curveball there. He points to some not so great examples from history, like what happened to the Aral Sea in the former Soviet Union.
The Aral Sea, I don't know much about that.
It was this massive lake, and basically the Soviet government's policies, all about industrialization and production, they ended up like destroying it. The whole ecosystem devastated.
Wow, seriously. So much for the communist environmental paradise.
Yeah, it's a bit of a wake-up call. Riker's point is that sometimes these regimes prioritize like immediate economic goals over long-term environmental sustainability.
It makes sense in a way,
Yeah.
right? If you're focused on redistributing wealth and achieving economic equality, maybe you're not thinking about the impact on the planet 50 years down the line.
That's the argument. And it raises some important questions about trade-offs,
Yeah.
What are we willing to sacrifice in pursuit of certain goals?
It's a reminder that no ideology is perfect.
Right.
That there are always going to be downsides, unintended consequences.
Exactly. It's about being honest about those costs and benefits, not just buying into the hype.
Okay, so the environment can take a hit under certain Marxist policies. What about the media? How does that factor into all this?
Ah, the media. That's a whole other can of worms. Riker argues that even in democratic societies, where you'd think we'd have a free press, the media often ends up promoting Marxist ideas, whether they realize it or not.
Hold on. Are you saying the media is secretly trying to brainwash us with communist propaganda?
Not necessarily intentional brainwashing, but Riker does suggest we need to be more critical of what we're consuming, Recognize how the way stories are selected and framed can push certain ideologies.
So it's about being aware of those filters, understanding that there's always an angle, even if it's not explicitly stated.
Precisely. Riker argues that being aware of those biases, both in ourselves and in the media we consume, is key to being a discerning and informed citizen.
It's like everyone's got a perspective, right? We all come to the table with our own assumptions. The media's no different.
Exactly. And Riker's encouraging a healthy dose of skepticism, reminding us to always think for ourselves.
Don't just take things at face value. Do your own digging and form your own conclusions.
That's the idea. Don't let yourself be spoon-fed information. Be an active participant, not just a passive consumer.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. Religion versus Marxist ideology, the environmental question, and how the media shapes our understanding of all this.
And don't forget about the psychological manipulation often used by these regimes, which, by the way, could be super relevant to your deep dive into power dynamics and covert contracts.
Right. There are some interesting parallels there. I'm starting to see how it all ties together.
It's all connected. But hey, Riker doesn't just leave us hanging with all this critique. He also offers what he calls a red-pilled response to Marxism.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. A red-pilled response. What does that look like?
Well, he emphasizes things like individual freedom, personal responsibility, limited government. Building a strong foundation based on solid principles.
So it's about empowering individuals, not relying on the government to solve all our problems.
Exactly. He argues that we need to rediscover those core values that have led to success and prosperity in the past, while also finding ways to address those very real concerns about inequality and injustice.
It's about finding that balance, right? Individual freedom with social responsibility.
Precisely. Riker believes that individual initiative, combined with a strong moral compass, is the key to building a better future. He's optimistic But he's also realistic. He knows it's going to take work, it's going to take vigilance.
It's inspiring, but it also feels kind of daunting. Can we really make that kind of difference?
Riker believes we can, but it starts with each of us, you know? Being informed, being engaged, being willing to challenge those comfortable narratives and think critically.
So it's not about waiting for someone else to fix things. It's about taking ownership.
Exactly. It's about recognizing our own agency and using it to create positive change. Starting with ourselves, our families, our communities, it's about building from the ground up.
I love that. It's empowering, but also a bit overwhelming. Where do we even start?
Riker's got some practical tips. He talks about seeking out alternative sources of information, having those tough conversations with people who hold different views, and supporting organizations that align with your values. And he really emphasizes the importance of strong families, strong communities, places where those values of hard work, responsibility, compassion are instilled from a young age.
So it's about starting small, building those strong foundations, and then expanding outward from there.
That's the idea. Focus on what you can control, make a difference in your own little corner of the world. Those ripples can spread outwards, create a bigger wave of change.
I like that analogy. It's about taking action, right? Both in our personal lives and in the wider world.
You got it. Riker's saying we can't just sit around and complain. We got to be active participants in shaping the world we want to live in.
Okay, that's a message I can get behind. It's not just a critique, it's a call to action. But I gotta admit, it also feels a little, well, overwhelming. There's so much to do.
And remember, you don't have to do it all at once. Riker emphasizes the importance of small steps, gradual change. Just find your own path, focus on what matters most to you, and take it one day at a time. And hey, the book is there to guide you. It's got tons of resources and further reading for anyone who wants to dive deeper.
So it's not just a book, it's like a roadmap, a guide to navigating this crazy world.
Exactly. It's about starting that journey of self-discovery and figuring out how you want to make your mark.
I like that. Okay, we've covered a ton of ground, but there's still more to explore, right?
You bet. Riker gets into some specific case studies that really bring his points to life. Plus, we'll talk about some practical steps we can all take to, actually put these ideas into action. It's about moving beyond theory and into the real world.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's get practical. Okay, so we're back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into debunking Marxism. We've been through a lot of theory, but Riker doesn't just stop there, right? He brings in some real-world examples to, drive his points home.
Oh, yeah. He definitely does. And it's super effective. Remember we were talking about the whole economic thing, how some Marxist policies can kind of backfire?
Yeah, like good intentions, but then things go sideways.
Exactly. Well, he uses Venezuela as a prime example. It's this cautionary tale, you know? What happens when ideology meets reality and things get messy?
Yeah, the book really paints a picture of how Venezuela went from, top of the game, super wealthy, to struggling to even get basic necessities. I mean, it's heartbreaking seeing those images.
It is. And Riker lays out this argument that it was those socialist policies that did it. Nationalizing industries, putting price controls in place, basically choking out the free market.
It's kind of like they took this perfectly good system and just dismantled it piece by piece. Good intentions maybe, but...
But a recipe for disaster, according to Riker. It really highlights that unintended consequences thing we were talking about, right?
Yeah, big time. Makes you think twice about those quick fixes, doesn't it?
For sure. It's a tough lesson, but it's a crucial one, especially when you think about the people caught in the middle. Riker doesn't shy away from the human costs, The families struggling, businesses going under, dreams just crushed.
Right. It's easy to get lost in the big ideas, but at the end of the day, it's real people's lives that are affected.
Exactly. Riker brings it back to that human element, makes it much more real,
It's a powerful reminder that ideas have power, and we need to think carefully about what we're putting out there. Okay, so Venezuela. Pretty compelling. What other examples does Riker use?
Well, he talks about East and West Germany before reunification. East Germany was under communist rule and they had all these shortages. The economy was stagnant.
Yeah, and that Berlin Wall, that's a powerful image. A literal wall dividing people, ideologies.
Totally. And Riker argues that the differences between East and West Germany weren't just about physical barriers, but about the systems they were living under.
Like freedom versus control.
Yeah.
Opportunity versus, well, not so much opportunity.
Exactly. West Germany, with its free markets and individual liberties, thrived. East Germany, not so much. It really shows you the difference those systems can make in people's lives.
Makes you appreciate what we have, that's for sure. But Riker doesn't just dwell on the past. He brings it into the present, too.
Oh, yeah. He argues that even today, even in countries like the US, Marxist ideas have kind of snuck in under the radar.
Really? Like, what are we talking about here? What should people be looking out for?
Well, he talks about things like the growing popularity of socialist ideas, especially among younger people. And then there's critical theory, which is becoming really influential, especially in academia. And the whole identity politics thing, that's a big one.
Okay, I can see how someone who's critical of Marxism might see those as red flags, but are they really all connected?
That's a good question. I mean, it's easy to throw that Marxist label around, right? But Riker's point is that even if the connection isn't always obvious, the underlying ideas, the themes, they often align with Marxist thinking.
So it's about looking past the surface, questioning the narratives we're being fed.
Exactly. Think critically, don't just take things at face value. Look a little deeper. Ask yourself, what are the assumptions here, and do I buy into them? That's what Riker's encouraging.
It's about being an active participant in the conversation, not just a passive observer. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the big takeaway you hope people will walk away with?
You know, I think the most important thing Riker wants us to do is to question. Question those narratives. Question the status quo. Don't be afraid to think for yourself. Seek out different perspectives. And most importantly, don't give up on the idea of a better future. You have the power to shape your own destiny, you know? You can contribute to building a world that reflects your values.
That's a great message. It's about empowerment, taking ownership, and yeah, not being afraid to think differently.
Exactly. And debunking Marxism, it's a great starting point for anyone who wants to go on that journey. It gives you the tools, the framework to understand these complex issues and make informed decisions about the kind of world you want to live in.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into debunking Marxism. It's been a wild ride for sure. Lots to think about, lots to unpack. But hey, that's what we're here for. Till next time, keep those minds open, keep asking those scuff questions, and keep searching for that better future.